The summons came on a Thursday. Formal tribunal, Council Pit 7, 9th hour. I had to look up what a formal tribunal was. It wasn't a punishment hearing. That would have been routed through the discipline office. A formal tribunal was something older, a procedural mechanism the Academy used when it needed to correct a classification error it couldn't fix quietly. The language in the notification was careful about that. It said, "Review of placement status." It said, "Evidentiary session." It did not say what everyone in my dormitory corridor already seemed to know, that the dean had personally requested the proceeding, and that the outcome was not expected to be contested. I had been at Vethrock Station for 11 weeks. I had been filed as a Tier 2 assessment candidate, which meant the intake system had flagged my application as requiring additional review before cohort assignment. I had assumed at the time that this was a routine processing delay. The intake officer who handed me my temporary badge had not corrected that assumption. What I understood by week 3 was that Tier 2 assessment was how the Academy warehoused applicants it didn't know what to do with. The cohort I sat with in morning review, 7 beings, 4 species, had arrived through miscategorized sponsorships, bureaucratic errors in planetary transit records, or, in one case, a clerical system that had mistaken a cargo manifest for an enrollment request. We were not cadets. We were a question the intake system had failed to answer. I took my seat in Council Pit 7 at the 9th hour. The room was smaller than I expected for something called a pit. Curved benches in a 3/4 arc, descending to a flat floor with a single table and a single chair. The ambient lighting was cool and even, the kind that makes everything look like it is being documented, which it was. A clerk sat at a secondary table with a recording plinth. The dean stood at the primary table. I had seen Dean Sorvith from a distance twice. Up close, she was shorter than her photograph suggested, with the lateral eye fold that I had learned was a marker of academic rank in Vethrak's primary species, a second membrane that closed horizontally when she was concentrating. It was closed now. She did not introduce herself. She said, "You were assigned to Tier 2 assessment on the basis of an intake irregularity. The irregularity has not resolved. Rather than continue to hold your file in an unclassified state, the Academy has convened this proceeding to establish grounds for a determination." I said, "All right." The membrane flickered. She had expected something else. "The proceeding," she said, "will involve 4 evidentiary sets. These are not examinations in the conventional sense. They are classification instruments, designed to locate an applicant within the Academy's assessment framework. At the conclusion, your file will be assigned a permanent status. Do you understand?" I said I did. The first set was spatial reasoning. A holographic field, 3 meters across, filled the center of the floor with a rotating structure of nested geometries. I was given a reference point and a set of constraint variables and told to identify the stable configuration. The field was designed, I learned later, for a 40-minute session. It was a tool used to assess upper-tier navigation candidates. I worked through it the way I had worked through similar problems in survey prep, not by modeling the whole structure, but by finding the invariants, the relationships that held regardless of rotation. You do not try to hold a 3-dimensional object in your head when you are working in the field. You find what does not change, and you anchor to that. I finished in 11 minutes, I said. Stable at configuration D7, assuming the third constraint is a soft boundary. The clerk looked at her plinth. She made a note. The second set was physiological stress assessment. A pressurized enclosure, the size of a small exam room, with atmospheric controls. I was told the session would evaluate tolerance thresholds across a range of environmental stressors: temperature, pressure, atmospheric composition. I was given a monitoring band and told to signal when I reached my limit. I had spent 4 winters above 4,800 meters doing survey work in the southern ranges, not because anyone assigned me there, but because the contract paid a supplement for high-altitude data collection, and I needed the money. The cold was manageable. The pressure differential was familiar. The modified atmosphere was the interesting part. A lower oxygen mix, designed to stress most applicant species within 20 minutes. At 38 minutes, the technician running the controls knocked on the panel and asked if my monitoring band was functioning correctly. I told him it was. He asked if I was experiencing any symptoms of distress. I said I was a little bored. He made a note on his tablet and ended the session. The third set was tactical pattern recognition, a rapid sequence display of spatial scenarios with an instruction to identify resource allocation decisions made by an absent command authority. I had done something similar in survey logistics, reading supply chain decisions made by people I never met, from the residue those decisions left in the field record. You learn to read the choices by their shadows. I moved through the sequence at the display's maximum pace and flagged 7 decision anomalies. The benchmark, I understood later, expected applicants to catch 2 or 3. The fourth set was the one that made Dean Sorvith stand up. It was a language acquisition module, not a translation test. The Academy knew my primary language. This was a test of structural inference. Given a fragmentary corpus of an unfamiliar language, identify grammatical rules, and produce 3 syntactically valid novel constructions. The module was used for upper-tier linguistics and communications candidates. The session window was 90 minutes. I had done something like this before, though not under those terms. Survey work takes you into contact zones. You do not always have a translator, and the Academy-issued translation software is notoriously poor on constructed and regional variants. You learn to read the grammar from the inside. Find the verb-object relationship first, because that is where the logical structure lives, and the rest follows. It is not difficult. It is just a kind of attention most people do not bother to develop because they assume they will have tools. I submitted 3 constructions at the 22-minute mark. The module flagged all 3 as valid. It also flagged a structural pattern I had identified in the corpus that the module itself had not been programmed to recognize. A tonal modifier class that was absent from the reference materials, but present in 6 of the 18 sample utterances. The clerk stopped making notes. She looked at Dean Sorvith. Dean Sorvith had been standing since the middle of the 3rd set. Now she walked to the clerk's table and looked at the plinth record herself. She was quiet for a long time. The lateral membrane closed completely and did not reopen. I waited. She said, "You came through the Tier 2 channel because the intake system flagged an anomaly in your application record." I said, "That is what the letter said." "The anomaly," she said, "was that your application did not fit any of the intake system's 47 candidate profiles. The system could not assign you a cohort, so it assigned you a hold status." I said, "I know." "It was not an error," she said. "The system was functioning correctly. It simply did not have a category for you." She looked at the plinth record again. She looked at me. The membrane opened, slowly, and she turned to the clerk. "Log the result," she said. "Classification unrestricted. Note the tonal pattern finding for the linguistics division, and contact the spatial systems track and the environmental endurance program and tell them the session records are available for review if they want them." The clerk said, "What cohort assignment?" Dean Sorvith said, "There isn't one. Log it as unrestricted and leave it there until the programs sort it out among themselves." She picked up her notes from the table and looked at me one final time. "You will receive a new badge," she said. "It will have a different designation. I would recommend you eat something before the programs start sending requests." Then she left. I sat for a moment in the empty pit. The recording plinth was still running. The clerk was copying the session log into the Academy's permanent record, working through the 4 sets in order, entering each result against the classification instrument's benchmark range, noting in each field the same 3-word entry: no upper bound. I picked up my datapad and walked out into the corridor. My old badge said Tier 2 assessment, pending. I wore it for the rest of that day because no one had told me yet where to get the new one. By evening, I had 4 meeting requests from division coordinators I had never heard of. By the following morning, there were 9. I went and got the badge.